Ramani, it's an honor for us to meet you, and thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to talk about your latest book in Spanish, No Eres Tú.
Muchas
How are
gracias. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so looking forward to it, and I'm honored to be here.
Oh, thank you. Well, I want to start by talking about the invitation. I think it was an invitation from Maria Shriver for you to write this book. Is it that not an invitation, but a suggestion? Is it true?
So actually, no. What happened was, I have been doing this work for a long time, and then and had taken a break from doing books. I was doing YouTube and all these other things, and then I connected with Penguin Random House and their imprint Penguin Life. And they said, "Listen, this is the kind of book we're looking for," and then that led to a series of meetings and then an outline for a book, and then I was about some maybe a few months after Penguin Life acquired the book, Maria Shriver's imprint, The Open Field, said they'd like to publish it. They published a couple of books a year on that imprint, feeling like it was, consistent with what, the kind of words they want to put out in the world. So I was lucky to connect with Penguin first, and then her imprint, which is at Penguin, then they went the next step, and then asked if I would be on their imprint. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing. We're so excited because I mean we work really close with Oceano, which is the Mexican.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when we saw that they had your book, it was like, wow, it's gonna help so much people, and it's a really good publishing house. So congratulations
Thank
for.
you so much. Thank you. I'm very grateful to Oceano too for getting it done, for getting it out there, and I really, really hope it gets into the hands of lots of people in Mexico and Central America. Yeah.
Yes, yes, surely. And for to start that, for people who don't understand the difference about how what is narcissism and what is the personality disorder, you start the book explaining that difference. Can you explain us how it got, how can we identify it, and how did you come about that world, if you will?
Yeah, I think it gets quite complicated because there's almost three levels to that conversation. The first issue is a lot of people hear the word narcissism. They think immediately of, the myth, and there's somebody who loves themselves and wants to look in the mirror, and that's not accurate. Or they go immediately to this idea of the personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, which also isn't fully accurate. And I wanted to make that distinction because a lot of times people say, well, I don't feel comfortable using this word. If it's a diagnosis, shouldn't this person be seen by a mental health practitioner? Now, while there is a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, a lot of people don't always get this diagnosis because this is a group of people who often doesn't seek therapy, right? These people with narcissistic personalities or personality disorder think that they're not responsible for anything. They blame other people, and they often walk around the world quite grandiose and arrogant, thinking that they're great and they just want lots of attention. So these are not people who are typically, like I said, ringing up a therapist's office unless things in their life aren't going the way that they think that they should be going, right? So the reason I make that distinction so clearly is that a lot of people were saying, well, they're not going to go see a therapist, so does that mean that I can never think that they're narcissistic? Narcissism is a personality style, and it's a personality style that's not always the healthiest personality style. It's pretty maladaptive, and a person who has this personality style always puts their needs ahead of other people, and it's characterized by certain patterns like low empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, pathological, extreme selfishness, a constant and excessive need for admiration and praise. These are people who are often very superficial and only focus on surface level things. So relationships aren't very deep. They're often relationships characterized by manipulation or betrayal. That's the personality style. And personality in all of us is a difficult thing to change. But this particular personality style is pretty darn near almost impossible to change, enough that it'll change the behavior. Because that's really the issue, right? Personality is personality, it's a person's traits. But that turns into behaviors that cause real problems in relationships. And then we have another problem, which is a lot of people are overusing this word. They're using the word narcissism to call a person who's selfish. They use the word narcissism to refer to somebody who's on social media a lot. And so we're taking this word that actually is quite complex and takes in a lot of different characteristics. And then when we use it in this oversimplified way, people sort of start rolling their eyes at it. And then the people who are actually going through relationships with people who are narcissistic start to doubt themselves, saying, well, everyone else is saying maybe we're using this word too often. Perhaps I'm using it too often too. So we're getting into a complicated part of this conversation.
So, do you think is it getting easier to identify it, to teach people? How has it been your process? Because how many years have been you working with this problem?
I've been working on this for over 20 years. So is it getting easier? I think there's a bigger conversation about it now for sure. And I think that people are starting to see how these things line up and are willing to say, this isn't healthy. And more than anything, that this probably isn't going to change. And more than anything else is it's not my fault. No, eres too. It's not you. It's not me. Right. And so
Exactly.
it's very much the sense that I think that people are getting better at. And the big difference I'm seeing, and I'm happy to see this, is more young people are starting to get it, right? So it's influencing, for example, how they date or how they, decisions they're making about long-term relationships. But, there's always been a lot of resistance to this conversation, and there always will be. Sometimes people feel it's sort of defeatist or dismissive, and you're saying, oh well, nobody's perfect, and this isn't about anyone being perfect. This is actually about people being harmful. This isn't just that one person makes one mistake and we're like, oh, you're saying you're narcissistic. But I think sometimes people are saying to the person who's suffering in the relationship, they're almost putting the focus on them. Well, maybe you're not, maybe you're expecting too much, maybe you're asking too much. So the people who are already being harmed by the relationship are often being questioned by the world. And that also becomes tricky because these are already people who've been suffering a lot. So I think we've made progress. There's no doubt about it. But the progress has been slow, and I'm always amazed when I see a bit of a setback.
And it's really hard. Maybe as you know, there's this theory that we're six people apart, like 6 degrees
Mm-hmm.
from
Mm-hmm.
knowing, I don't know, the whole world or something. How many degrees are we away from a narcissistic or yeah, this the disorder, the personality, all of that?
Well, I think that every one of us has at least one narcissistic person in our lives. I really do. The estimation is that probably 1 in 10 people is narcissistic, right? So that means 9 in 10 aren't, but 1 in 10 are. If 10 people, statistically speaking, one of them is probably narcissistic. Now, for some people, it's very significant relationships in their life that are affected by narcissism, like a parent or a spouse, right? But in other cases, it might be maybe more of a less significant player, like a family member they don't see so often, might be a neighbor, something like that. So I think everyone is affected by this. It could be someone you work with, and that can actually be that can affect you a lot. So I think everybody has this in your life, in their lives. I'm always surprised when I meet someone who says, "I don't think I've ever met anyone like this before," and I'm thinking, A, you're very fortunate, and B, maybe you just have a very small social world. So every so often I'll run into it. But what I will say is that even though I think all of us have at least one person with this personality style in our life, not everyone is horribly affected by it. Like, for example, if the narcissistic person in your life is a person who may not have that much power over your life, you may view them more as an annoyance or someone you don't necessarily look forward to seeing, but you don't view yourself as suffering terribly. But if this is a relationship that you can't escape from, or it's a relationship that shaped you, for example, in childhood, then the impact of it is far, far more significant.
And usually, obviously, I when I started seeing you, watching your YouTube videos and so on, you have helped me a lot. Let me
Oh, thank
let me
you.
say that. So obviously, in my life, what I understood from many videos from you and another book is that in my case, for example, my grandfather was had the personality. So my husband was that, and the work environment that it
Hmm.
was normal for me to flow with what I knew. And is it normal for that? It's like if you know it from home, you might be. I mean, it's not. You don't feel discouraged when you find a boss that's the same trait, and you're, oh, I mean, repressed in several ways because they have so much power over you,
Hmm. Yeah,
right?
no, it's funny. What you're describing in some ways is what we call the intergenerational patterns. It's not unusual for a person who might have grown up with this in a family of origin, then to find themselves in such a relationship for example, a marriage or something like that. Um, and what also happens is if you have several of these relationships in your life, it sort of starts to feel like your new normal. It's not that you like it. It doesn't mean that you're suffering from it, but you might question yourself, or you might painfully think that, well, this is how relationships are, that they're hurtful or painful, or maybe I'm asking too much, or maybe I'm being too demanding, or maybe I'm being too sensitive. So I don't think it's unusual for people to have these in several areas of their life, in a marriage, in the workplace, in the family of origin, all of that. But I do think that it can also be quite intergenerational. And if we grew up with it, it almost makes it seem like this is how it is. So when it shows up in an adult relationship, we are less likely to question it.
Mm-hmm. And now after reading other books and all of that, I have a couple of friends that, I mean, we're out of that circle, not entirely, but the domination of it, and it's really hard to show it to other people because it's a long wait for you to get better also, no? So the other
Mhm.
ones can't get saved, if you will. The ones that we're trying to do our best to get out of it, and still you need your tools, the tools that you
Mhm.
talk about in your book. I want to talk about the tools
Mhm.
you need to, like, I usually have my Bible and your book near me when I have a complicated conversation, because I feel like you're coaching us, like you're
Yeah.
okay, you're gonna go through this and that, and it's
Mhm.
okay, and that it's amazing. So can you share with us some of those tools for the people who.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that one of the key tools, number one, is what we're doing right now, and even just initially reading the book, is education. It's knowing that it's a pattern and understanding it. That's number one. Number two is something that I call radical acceptance. And not everybody likes the term radical acceptance, but what it really means is that it's a painful acceptance that these patterns are not going to change. The other person's behavior is not your fault. When they behave these ways, it's still going to hurt you. But if you can really make that adjustment to it's not going to change, you can have more realistic expectations of their behavior. And I always say the goal of radical acceptance in some ways is that you're no longer surprised by their behavior. Doesn't mean you're not hurt by their behavior. It doesn't mean that their behavior doesn't affect you, but you're not surprised. And that element of surprise is where you feel foolish, right? If you kept having your purse taken away over and over and over again, saying, okay, I'm doing something wrong, I feel foolish, like I should tie it around me or not carry it this way. It's something similar here, is that we feel foolish, but when we stop being surprised, we're like, well, of course, this is what's happening. It's actually a little bit easier even on our nervous system. But sadly, when we get to that place of radical acceptance, we can feel very sad. It's a real sense of grief because what we'd hoped for, this person would change or that this relationship would be healthy, that's not something that's going to happen. And so it means really giving up on this ever being what we want it to be, which is very painful. And so what that means is in as radical acceptance happens, a lot of people find themselves at sort of a crossroads. And not everybody is able to leave these relationships. Not everybody can have a divorce. Not everybody can step away from their families. We know culturally, certainly in culture, Mexico is a great example. Families are close knit. You can't just say I'm not speaking to this one, that one. It's often like, no, that's not going to work. So sometimes people feel like it's just from my culture. I can't just step away. But that doesn't mean that you have to stay in it the way you've always been. It can mean that now you know how this is. You can disengage in certain ways. Maybe you don't take on the same conversations. And I always say to folks, an important tip to remember is you control what you share. So maybe you don't always take your good news to the narcissistic person first. Maybe you tell the healthier people in your life first, or people who will be happy for you. And then when finally, if you actually ever share it with a narcissistic person, you've always already had the experience of enjoying it rather than having them make fun of you from the beginning. The
Exactly.
same thing applies with bad news. Sometimes narcissistic people are often the worst people to take bad news to. They'll often get angry at you for inconveniencing them. Same thing. You need supports you can take that to, work it through, and only if you need to, down the line, share that. And some people say they find this really hard because they're saying, then if you're telling me I can't share the good news, that I shouldn't share the bad news, what's left? And sadly, it's very either superficial topics or just talk about them because
Right.
they're not interested. And so those kinds of things sort of shed a light on realistically what these relationships are really about. And then as you come through these, sort of learning to disengage more and more, a key element of healing is building up your own social supports. Because I always say there's this sort of 90%, 10% problem we have is that we tend to give 90% of our time and our effort and our psychological energy to the most narcissistic and toxic people in our lives. We really do, because we're trying to
Yeah.
please them and do things they want and think that we'll finally get it just right. And I always tell people, why don't you change that math? No amount of what you do for them is going to be enough. So why don't you start putting more of that time into your healthier relationships? Because many times the healthiest people in our lives, they don't get mad at us if we don't always show up. They don't expect those kinds of things of us. And yet they're such nourishing spaces for us and for them with us, right? And so I always tell people, try to flip this around a little. Like just do the bare minimum where the narcissistic relationship's concerned, because nothing you do is ever going to be enough anyhow. But by building up some of those other healthy sources of support in your life, it really can make a big difference where your mental health is concerned. And then you'll have these validating spaces that will strengthen you to be able to continue navigating these narcissistic relationships. I also tell people that if you leave one of these relationships, it can actually be very difficult. The narcissistic person may feel angry, they may feel out of control, they may make your life actually quite miserable.
Yeah.
Again, everything's about preparation. Not that preparation makes it go away, nor does it fully make it easier. But sometimes when you're ready for something, you're making better choices for yourself. But again, you're just prepared for it in a different way. And then finally, I also tell people that this is the healing. Ultimately, what healing is about finally sort of figuring out who you are separate from this relationship. We spend so much time in these relationships being what the narcissistic people want us to be, looking the way they want us, doing what they want us to, that we lose sight of who we are. And the real deep work of healing is, who are you? What are you about? What do you stand for? What matters to you? Figuring out what are the things that you enjoy in life? What gives you meaning? What gives you purpose? Again, if you can't leave the relationship, it doesn't mean you can't have this kind of self-exploration. It does mean, though, however, there's often a more performative version of you that comes into the narcissistic relationship. But by cultivating that true sense of you, you're not living forever in this sort of shadow. Plants don't grow in the shadows, right?
Mhm.
And so you've got to sort of move some of that out of the way so you can grow. And part of that means that you have to understand how these relationships work and give yourself space and time to learn from this relationship, but not take responsibility for it. Because people in these relationships often blame themselves. And that's why the book is called It's Not You, No Eres Tu. It's not you. This is their behavior. Don't take responsibility for it. And they're never going to take responsibility for it. And
Yeah.
that's we're right back at that radical acceptance.
Yeah, because it feels like a battlefield in a way. No, it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
you have to measure. I felt it like and reliving the book with being aware and knowing it wasn't me and other friends who shared also, because you always have friends that suffer the same, but most of them don't share. Sometimes, well, not most, sometimes they don't share, they're going through the same things.
Correct.
No, but maybe you already accepted it. Maybe you're already grieving that, because you've never had fully that person's love or attention or acceptance or nothing, if you like positive, if you will. So there are a lot of moments that it's like you have to be the best you can also to share with someone else, because that other someone, that other victim, if you will, may drag you down, no?
Mhm,
Because maybe
mhm,
you're in step 5 and she's in step 1, and then you go, because there's a reaction, no, in the brain, the anxiety and all of that, and that like disconnects you from when with the trauma starts when you're dealing with narcissistic people, no?
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Mhm. I do think that it's first of all, I did write the book so people wouldn't feel alone. A lot of people don't have a place they can talk about this, or they feel judged if they talk about this. So you're not alone. But you bring up a really interesting issue, which is not everyone is at the same stage of healing. And there are some people who, in the very beginning stages, are at a different place than you. Not everyone is also ready to hear your experience of it. A lot of people, and this is why I write a lot in the book about these ideas of enablers, and people sometimes call them flying monkeys and smear campaigns, is that once you realize what this is, whether it's with like a husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend, or it's with or whether it's with a family member, a lot of people don't like hearing about these things. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes them uncomfortable. Like you're almost, you know, poking at their world view of the world, right? So some people will, again, they have no problem saying, well, this sounds like it's your problem. You shouldn't use that word narcissistic. That doesn't make sense here. But at the same time, when you hear about other people going through this, it can be very triggering. Because I think that when people are going through narcissistic relationships and they're just beginning to heal and they're in the early stages of healing, hearing other people's stories, yeah, you don't feel alone, but you also might feel that sense of helplessness that you felt when you were in the relationship. And going through narcissistic relationships is really a form of what we call betrayal trauma, that your trust was broken over and over and over and over again, and you never really got to feel safe in the relationship. But yet at the same time, everyone was telling you this is a safe relationship. So there was a real disconnection there, right? Like, this is your family. Of course, you're safe with your family, but you don't feel safe with your family. So in order to stay in your family, you have to deny the very truth of who you are. And that's a trauma. That disconnection is a trauma. And people will sometimes, like you said, feel dissociated from themselves, feel very anxious, feel very numb. I think it's understanding what all of this is and understanding how you carry a lot of this in your body also matters quite a bit.
course. I was going to start with this, but I got carried away with the other questions. But I really want to talk. I mean, just to mention, I loved how in the introduction you quote Eli Wiesel
Yeah.
uh, about if you remain neutral, you're part
Yeah.
of with the oppressor, no,
Yeah. Hmm.
and not with the victim. So can you explain why you chose it? I mean, we know, but for the
Hmm.
extent of the people who are gonna come through your book.
Right. So the quote, the Elie Wiesel quote is, neutrality always helps the oppressor, never the oppressed, right? And
Mhm.
what it comes down to, and I'm so glad you highlighted that quote, because very few people have interviewed me have, and I'm so glad you did,
Mhm.
because it's a reminder that in many ways, what people don't want is the uncomfortable reminder of what this sort of relationship dynamic shows, right? So people say, I'm not going to get involved, or that's other people's business. But the problem is this dynamic, right? It's not just about two people. Then, if we take it a bit bigger, it's about a family. And then we take it a bit bigger, it might be in various institutions in a community, like in a school or in a business. We take it a little bit bigger, it's in the local government. Take it bigger, it's in a bigger institution. Take it bigger, it's in a national government. And now
Mhm.
that national government is putting forth policies that do end up, you know what I'm saying? It's that's
Yes.
the problem, is when we're neutral to the suffering of one, we start becoming neutral to the suffering of many. And most of the time that people who are being harmed in these relationships are very imbalanced, or what we call asymmetric. Somebody has much more power. In a healthy relationship, there's a balance of power, right? And so narcissistic relationships are about that imbalance. But when we say, like, oh, we shouldn't talk about these narcissistic relationships, or that's not very nice, or everything can be figured out, that kind of, again, neutrality stance, that just maintains the status quo. And this status quo, this way things have been, has been like this for a long time. People have been suffering in relationships like this for a long time. And sometimes the pushback get is, well, if people have been suffering, why are you bringing it up now? I'm like, because they've been suffering. It needs to end. And generation after generation after generation is suffering. And there's a chance here to help end some of these cycles and potentially get some people into healthier relationships and lives and have a more whole sense of self. And if we have healthier human beings in the world all around, or more of them, then we have a healthier world at large.
Of course, because it's like even, I mean, quoting here Eli Wiesel, he being a Jewish in trapped in the Second World War, and everything that his people went through. It's like at some point the oppressed, in any moment of in any country, in any timeline of, I mean, there's one, as you said, someone it's getting oppressed, the power of.
Correct.
And now the social media, what
Yeah.
I try to get here is, we thought it was gonna help us, saying, crying, crying wolf, or saying this guy, and then the mirrors are shifted, so like everything is distorted. No?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it feels unempowering, but I love in the book that you stay like you're the one who's in charge, you're the one who's empowered. Even if in, if you're in an environment like this, as you said, in work, well, probably you love your job, but you need to do this in order to do this, and balance the consequences, no, like, and being aware. But you think, we can go to the police, we can go to this and that, but you gotta be healed, no? It's, of course, it's gotta change outside, but first inside, in order for us to help others, no?
Yeah,
So
you can't wait for the outside to change. If you keep waiting for the outside world to change, then you're forever going to be living in a prison. I mean, this is really a book about saying that even if you can't leave these relationships, there you can start cutting some of these, we these relationships, narcissistic relationships are described as subjugated relationships where you're sort of like almost psychologically imprisoned by the other person because the relationship really exists only to serve their needs. They're not interested in you, right? You serve their a convenience for them to be what they want you to be, right? And so even if people can see that, like I said, even if they can't get out, they don't think that that's right, right? Like you're even just shedding a light on that this is not a healthy dynamic. So even again, some people can't readily get out or immediately can't make a change, but at least can give themselves some permission to say this isn't healthy. Now that's hard. It's hard to be stuck in something is not healthy. But before big systems changes can happen, because those are going to take forever. And I think sometimes we go backwards, frankly, is that people have to work, have the opportunity to work on some of this themselves and at least have some light shed on it so it can lift some of the responsibility. Because as long as we keep telling people that their own harm, that someone harming them is their fault, they're going to be stuck. At least we can say they are harming you. That's what's happening. And that's why you feel like this. That changes things quite a bit.
of course. And for the new generations, can you say is the most important lesson to teach young people about recognizing and dealing with the narcissistic behavior?
I think for young people, it's knowing what it is. It's, we talk about this dynamic of love bombing, right? Like the sort of really interesting, engaging, kind of superficial, exciting, fun first part of the relationship. Be aware at that phase, right? I mean, especially these days when people are meeting through dating apps and all these things, it's very superficial. It's pictures, it's text conversations, it's a lot more surface, right? And it's trusting yourself to know what are healthy and what are unhealthy patterns in a relationship. Someone invalidating you is not healthy. Someone doubting your reality is not healthy. It doesn't matter. And the idea that, well, that we're having so much fun and they took me on, that we went to we did such fun things together and I haven't felt like this and it's so exciting. That's not an eraser for the
Mm.
bad things that are slowly happening. And I think it's very difficult, especially in the early part of a relationship, to balance uncomfortable things that are happening with really enjoyable things that are happening. And it doesn't mean everyone has to go running away from a relationship immediately as soon as it starts feeling uncomfortable. But it is important that you also don't cut that information out, that you pay attention to it. And that when you are finding yourself doubting yourself a lot in a relationship, talk to someone about it. Sometimes just that trusted voice can make a big difference, but also trust yourself.
Mhm.
Most people who've been in narcissistic relationships will tell me, from the beginning, I knew something wasn't exactly right, but I was at a certain age. I felt a pressure to get married. I felt a pressure to have children. Everyone told me this is a great guy, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's really bad. I mean, in any stage of our life to listen to everybody and not yourself. I mean, something that, I mean, if you're in grammar school and listen to yourself and your mom or whatever, it's amazing, but
But we don't give children permission to listen to themselves. I mean, I think that's the big problem is that again, there's such pressure around relationships, and it's recognizing that there's something I talk about in the book, which is the first time something happens, it happens. If the same thing happens a second time, it's a coincidence. If the same thing happens a third time, it's a pattern. And at the point something's a pattern, pay attention. And then if you want to communicate about it at that time, see what happens. If the person says, "Oh, it takes ownership and apologizes and changes it," great. Then you've grown. But if you say something and point out this pattern and the person rages at you or becomes very defensive or blames you for it or doesn't take responsibility, pay attention to that.
breathe, 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 take some water. It's okay, it's okay.
Pay attention to that because it's not going to be likely to change.
Mhm. Yeah, breathe. Give you a minute.
Thank you.
And I was thinking at some point when you stop being so vulnerable, as you say, there are some moments, but you might get triggered. But as soon as you change, the narcissistic also knows that you changed.
Yeah.
You know,
They
that's
do. They do. Yes. You bring up such an important point here is that it's not as simple as I'm going to make these changes in myself and everything's going to be fine. For all the lack of empathy and all the lack of self-awareness that narcissistic people have, they're also very socially perceptive. And they have to be socially perceptive because narcissistic people are often very socially successful. Right? They do well. They're excellent in business and all these other things. So they're almost overly focused on the room. And some people argue that narcissism is a bit of a post-traumatic state, which would make them more focused on threats and everything in their environment. But what that means is if you start making little changes in yourself, maybe disengaging more, maybe not getting into the same arguments with them, they're going to notice. And those arguments were really once a place that they would get a lot of power in the relationship. And now you're changing that. And that's not nearly as gratifying for them. And so some people have said, it's interesting. I started changing things inside myself and responding differently. And it actually didn't go very well. They were actually more angry at me now than they were before.
Mhm. But then you start, it's clearer for
Correct.
you. No,
Correct.
no.
Correct.
Okay, I'm leaving.
Hmm.
Thank you. Just like
That's
give
right.
you like the last bump. I'm gonna help
Hmm.
you. Uh, you're deactivating the bumps
That's
also.
exactly right. That's exactly right.
That's amazing. And can you share any trait that how can you say? Because I feel they're like sharks in many areas of our life. The I mean those the they're I forgot the name. Yeah, well, they're sharks in a way. So you don't know. There's as you said, they're superficial. So there's a fine exterior and all of that. And what would you say? Like, if you could say, like, I want to scream this to so many people and they don't listen. What can you say that we should be aware of or understand or anything that you want to share with us?
I think a lot of people, as they go through their healing and they learn about this, are like, I want everyone to know this. I want everyone to understand this. I want to tell people that this is happening. I want to say, look, this is our brother. Don't do it. I think
Mhm.
the funny thing is that It's one of those pieces of information that the world is still uncomfortable with, and that you're learning about it is great, and you're doing your work on it is great. But I think that we get, once again, we get caught in the loop of we're trying to prove something. It's like, look, my pain is worthy. Look, I need you to see this. This is inside work, Now, being in therapy, talking to people who get it, great. But this idea of I need other people to see this, I understand why that is, because these relationships feel so unjust. They feel so unfair. It feels as though the narcissistic person is getting away with so much, right? And then they don't ever seem to get consequences and they move easily into a new relationship. It doesn't feel fair. But I have to say, and this is one more unfairness, if you walk around and say, look, they're narcissistic, look, they're gaslighting me, instead of the world saying, oh my goodness, you're right, I'm so sorry, oftentimes the world will react negatively to the person who's saying that and saying, you shouldn't say that, and or I don't understand what you're saying or what's your point. So people who are often in their healing will feel doubted, and that might lead them to question themselves. So I think that when people start getting this information, they want everyone to know. And I always say, listen, this is almost like a little secret you've been told. I'm hoping millions of people get this secret through the book, but it's like a little bit of a secret you've been told, and use it for your own behalf, but
Mm,
don't make yourself some sort of a person who feels compelled to share this with everybody. Like, I think the mistake people will often make is that they'll go into a family system where people aren't yet ready to hear that this is the father in the family. And
mm,
then then this person who is finding that this information is helpful for them, saying, hey, I want you all to know our father's narcissistic, or everyone will get angry at them. And so you're now once again in this position of losing support and all of that. So it's a very gradual process, but it's very tempting to want to say, I want everyone to know, I want to pull the curtain back, I want everyone to see what this really is. Unfortunately, it doesn't go that way. And I always tell people to move very cautiously at those times. You have a valuable piece of information, use it to your protection. If people want to know more, they'll approach and you can gently tell them.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's how I kind of felt, because at some point I did the same. You feel so overwhelmed when you
Uh,
start thinking this is not normal. You overshare, people start judging, and then you have an extra layer of
mm,
pressure and noise in your head.
correct. That's
So
right.
so read the book, go to therapy, and keep it a little bit to yourself.
And keep it and let it be your little secret and maybe your secret with everyone else who's read the book. So when I
Share
come to
the book.
Guadalajara, I'm going to make sure I bring little buttons that have the book's title. You could wear the button around and like, oh, you get it. I can talk to you.
That's amazing. Uh, Dr. Romani, thank you so much for your time. It
Thank you
was
for having me.
amazing. And I mean, I'm again oversharing a little bit, but it's just such an honor. I mean, your videos, your compassion, your books, and I mean, it's like a different lifetime for me and my mom and another person in our life that we were together, that we changed the the outcome from a family who had this problem, and now I mean we change everything. We it's but that shifting, and not the and you hold our hands to remove the layers of everything that doesn't belong to us. So
Thank
thank
you. That's such a kind way to that's a kind thing to share with me. I appreciate that so much. And I'm very honored to have been part of your healing. Thank you.
thank you, Dr. Well,
Thank you.
I hope you have a beautiful time in Guadalajara.
I'm sure I will. I'm sure I will. Mexico's a beautiful country with beautiful people. So I really, really look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you again. And is there anything else you want to share and
No,
say?
just please get the book now that it's in Spanish. I think even people who said, "Oh, I read it in English," if Spanish is your first language, sometimes reading a book in your mother tongue, in your mother language, can sometimes hit you more emotionally. So, and for people who felt like, "Ah, I want to get it," but yeah, now it's there. So yeah. Hmm.
Thank you, Doctor, and hope that we have your work for many more years, and
Thank
that
you.
you feel, I mean, that you see the change even faster, no? Because
I hope
sometimes
so. I hope so. Yeah. I'm
yeah.
already seeing it. I'm already seeing it. And like I said, the big change I hope to see is in younger people. Yeah.
So let's work with
Hmm.
younger people.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
You
my dear.
take
Thank
care.
you. Thank you so much.
Nice
Bye-bye
to meet
now.
you.
It was
Bye.
nice to meet
Thank
you too.
you.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.